Nuclear negotiations. The European Union plays mediator between Trump and Tehran to save an agreement. But can both sides be satisfied? I'm Imran Gata, and today's newsmaker is the Iran nuclear deal. EU diplomats are scrambling to save what's considered by many to be an agreement that averted a war. But for US President Donald Trump, it's the worst deal in history. Trump wants significant changes to be made to the Iran nuclear deal, and he wants them in the next 2 months. Among them, an Iranian ban on nuclear energy and an open-door policy for international inspectors. The Iranian government is adamant in its rejection of those demands. So what's left for Germany, France and Britain to propose? Because if Donald Trump thinks they're not bringing the hammer down on Tehran, Israel has a few ideas, namely sanctions and preemptive strikes. Christine Pirovalakis reports.
As I have said many times, the Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into.
Iran's nuclear deal may be close to extinction. President Donald Trump has threatened to pull the United States out and wants Europe to go along with him. He's given France, Germany, and Britain an ultimatum: either fix the accord or he'll walk away from it in less than 2 months. In January, Trump suspended economic sanctions against Iran as required by the U.S. Congress every 120 days. But if he chooses to impose sanctions, the deal will collapse. And he's warned this is the last chance. He's asked American and European negotiators to make radical changes to the pact. That includes curbing Iran's ballistic missile program and disengaging it from conflicts around the Middle East, as well as opening Iranian military bases to international inspectors. Eager to save the deal, European countries are caught in the middle. They have voiced concerns over the missile program and raised the possibility of new sanctions.
I have informed you of the points we have been able to make on the nuclear agreement and the need for action so that the international community can act to prevent a humanitarian disaster.
Iran's missile program is not covered by the nuclear deal, and Tehran says it will not bow to pressure to halt it.
شک‌های ما برای دفاع از خودمون هست، تدافعی هست و هیچگاه موشک ما برای سلاح کشتار جمعی هم ساخته نشده، چون ما اصلا سلاح کشتار جمعی رو نداریم و ممنوع میدونیم، حالا هسته‌ایش یا غیر هسته‌ایش. بنابراین ما در این زمینه مذاکره با کسی نداریم.
I can state that Iran is implementing its nuclear-related commitments.
Under the agreement signed in 2015 between Iran and 6 world powers, Tehran scaled back its uranium enrichment and allowed the international nuclear watchdog to inspect its facilities. In exchange, sanctions were lifted, allowing Iran to resume trading oil and gas on the international market. It was seen as a win for world peace and one of the defining features of Barack Obama's presidency. But the agreement did not address Iran's ballistic missile tests or its role in regional conflicts. Iran has sent weapons and thousands of soldiers to Syria to help Bashar al-Assad in the country's 7-year war. It also has one of the Middle East's largest missile programs, and some of its precision-guided missiles have the range to strike Israel.
The best way to prevent the nuclearization of the Middle East is to either fully fix the Iran deal or fully nix it.
Iran says Trump's threats have scared international oil and gas investors away, denying Tehran the benefits it was promised for giving up its enrichment program.
Mr. Trump is trying to destabilize market conditions for those who want to work in Iran.
The fallout over the nuclear deal is taking place against the backdrop of increasing unpredictability in the region, leaving Europeans with the task of trying to preserve the agreement while satisfying both Iran and Trump. Christine Pirovalakis, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined from London by former Iranian diplomat Mehrdad Khonsari. We also have Iranian political specialist Masouma Torfeh, who's a researcher at the London School of Economics. And in Washington, D.C., James Phillips. He's a senior research fellow for Middle Eastern Affairs at the Heritage Foundation. I thank you all for joining us. Mehrdad Khonsari, let me begin with you. The Europeans are bending to try to preserve this Iran deal. Trump has said he's going to rip it up. There's 2 months to go. Is this a good idea, trying to amend the deal and come up with a new one?
Well, I think that wanting to improve the deal is certainly a proposition that can be advanced, but it's how you try to improve the deal by changing the goalposts unilaterally, issuing ultimatums, or providing incentives so that this agreement that was achieved peacefully can be sort of amended in a peaceful fashion that is to the advantage of everyone. We have a bit of unorthodox American diplomacy. In the one sense, they issue ultimatums for wanting to renegotiate an already negotiated deal with Iran, and they issue ultimatums to places like North Korea for not negotiating. So I think this is an issue that has to be worked out by them, but I believe that there is room for further negotiation with Iran to resolve many other outstanding issues, but certainly issuing ultimatums and unilaterally pulling out does not seem to me to be a very sound and very, sort of a hopeful sign.
Okay, James Phillips, so changing the goalposts unilaterally, and once again the reminder that this was a peacefully achieved deal. Is Trump being reckless with something that's good? It ain't broke. Why try to fiddle with it?
Well, I would argue that the goalposts remain the same, preventing Iran from ever attaining a nuclear weapon. And I think in the course of negotiations, the Obama administration stepped away from those goalposts and decided to allow Iran not only to keep its illegitimate nuclear facilities and legitimizing them, allowing Iran to keep them operating in some instances, that the Obama administration moved the goalposts to make it easier to attain an agreement it knew it could not get congressional approval for, so it did an end run around Congress, and that has allowed the Trump administration to come back and say, this is just an executive agreement, we don't agree with it, we need to amend it to make it stronger, or we'll walk away from it. So I would argue that by warning that it will walk away from the agreement, the Trump administration has left the door open for saving the previous agreement through a follow-on or amendment agreement, amending agreement.
Okay, Masouma Torfeh, we've heard Trump reportedly telling Benjamin Netanyahu last week that he will not show any flexibility in renegotiating the Iran nuclear deal with European powers. When you hear that, what does it tell you?
Well, the point is that this JCPOA, as it's known, is not up for negotiation. That's something that the Americans are forgetting. I mean, mainly Donald Trump, but also Nikki Haley, the U.S. ambassador at UN, and Mr. Mike Pence, the vice president, as well as Mr. Netanyahu. This particular agreement is not up for negotiation. What Iran is claiming, and the Deputy Foreign Minister of Iran said at Chatham House last week, was that, we're open to negotiations, but this particular JCPOA has to be honored first, and then we open up for other negotiations. And I think that makes sense because Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Trump may be in a hurry to change or to create an appendix to the present agreement, but this is not part of what has been accepted. And also, the terms that Mr. Trump wants are terms which are outside JCPOA, namely the ballistic missiles and also some of more close-up checks on Iran. Iran claims that there has been 9 times the checks by IAEA, and it has honored its agreement, and so the other side should. And also Iran says it's blocking business, it's blocking trade, which is damaging for everyone.
Right.
And one more point I would say here, and that is to do with the fact that Mr. Trump may be saying all these things about his worries about nuclear, but at the same time, according to Washington Post, he's signing a deal with Saudi Arabia for selling them multi-billion-dollar nuclear, civil nuclear, but it's there. So we can see that it's a dual game, and it's not correct.
Okay, James, let me ask you: have the Iranians, in your opinion, cheated on the deal at all?
They have twice violated the restrictions on heavy water, and they went over those. It was a technical violation. The Obama administration chose to turn a blind eye to it. They also have been caught trying to buy illicitly dual-use nuclear technology in Germany. That brings to mind the question of why they are still doing that, if they are still maintaining their commitments under the agreement.
Okay, so Mehrdad, has there been enough evidence in the behavior of the Iranians to suggest that they can't be trusted to adhere to the conditions and the terms of the deal long term?
No, I don't believe so. And I think that whilst, those technical violations may have taken place, but they were certainly not very serious, and not serious enough, at least for the IAEA to want to correspond with that kind of a viewpoint. Iran has stuck to its part, and I believe that irrespective of what ultimatum President Trump issues or what he does, and if he walks away, so long as Iran sticks to the provisions of the JCPOA, I don't believe that the other parties who are co-signatories to this will back away from it. Now, the point is that this will increase tensions and will not help remove the tensions that Iran so badly needs to remove. Now, sadly, Iran is in a desperate situation in the sense that it does not have many options, and the United States, I believe, is trying to take advantage of that, having itself reneged on implementing the removal of sanctions to the fullest, as promised by the Obama administration, not the Trump administration. The money does not go into Iran. Banking restrictions and control of, banking transactions with Iran have all remained in place, irrespective of the provisions of JCPOA.
But hold on, Mehrdad. What happened to the $500 billion that they were supposed to have made from the deal that got freed up? They're doing business with the Europeans, which puts the Europeans, I guess, in a slightly
First of all, there is no $500 billion. There were talk of any amount of Iranian reserves held in foreign banks, which could have amounted maximum to 150 billion, which was in reality the amount that was available to Iran was far less than that. But that was Iran's own money, which is part of the reserves it holds. The Saudi Arabians, for example, as Mustafa was referring to, they have reserves of 600 billion, or the UAE, a small country, has reserves of several $100 billion. So that is not something to persecute Iran over. That is their own money from the sale of oil that had accumulated and to which they had no access.
Let me develop that a little bit.
Funding for Iranian projects has not happened.
Okay, so let me develop that a bit further and take it to Messouma. Messouma, there's a political argument made here, away from the technicalities of ballistic missiles and nuclear energy and so forth. The political argument has been that since the Obama administration signed the deal with the Iranian government, the Obama administration was naive to the fact that Iran has been conducting empire building in the region, whether it's supporting Assad in Syria, whether it's what's going on in Lebanon and Yemen and so forth. And that is at the heart of Trump's fears. That's at the heart of Netanyahu's fears and others. Would you accept that that argument is perhaps even half right?
Yes, if the contents of the argument were convincing, but unfortunately they are not coming up with any solid points that could be acceptable. The points that they are raising about ballistic missiles or Iran's actions in Syria, these cannot stand up to argument really, because as we see, there are a lot of different countries involved in Syria. It's not just Iran that's involved in Syria. Many of the European countries, the United States, Saudi Arabia, everyone is involved in Syria. So, okay, negotiations can take place with Iran over its actions in Syria. It could even be reprimanded maybe for some actions. But Iran claims that it is there on the invitation of the Syrian government. Now, the other thing is the ballistic missiles. Ballistic missiles, Iran claims it needs because of the repeated threats of attacks by Israel and by the United States. And if you watch or listen to the speeches that are made by, for instance, Vice US President Mike Pence or Nikki Haley, you see that these theatrical expressions of hatred towards Iran would make you feel, to say nothing of Mr. Netanyahu and his theatrical performance at Munich Security Conference. So Iran is, of course, concerned about possible attacks. And so it says, I need to improve my military, and that's what the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, has ordered to do.
Okay, let's ask James Phillips. James Phillips, is that fair that Nikki Haley and Mike Pence and Benjamin Netanyahu are making theatrical threats against Iran, and any reasonable country would take precautions in the face of those threats?
I don't recall them chanting death to Iran or death to the Iranian regime. You know, the scale of what they're saying is eclipsed by some of the rhetoric coming out of Tehran. I agree that Syria is beyond the scope of this kind of agreement, and although, you know, the missiles were outside the scope of the JCPOA, it is a long-standing, you know, proliferation criteria that one of the elements of a nuclear program are the means to deliver it, and Iran has developed, second only to Israel in the Middle East, a ballistic missile force that does not make sense on a medium-range basis, because those missiles are right now are armed with conventional weapons that are illogical in military terms, which indicate they have plans for a nuclear follow-on. And that's one reason why many argue that the ballistic missile tests are a violation of the spirit of the deal, because it shows Iran is still making progress on the delivery system. So I don't think that's too much to ask. You know, it will probably be a separate type agreement, and I actually personally think there's little chance of it being negotiated, but if there is no follow-on agreement, then I think it is almost certain that President Trump will reimpose sanctions, and once that happens, even if Iran and the Europeans and Russia and China decide to stay within the JCPOA, that the agreement itself will end up being null and void.
Right. Mehrdad Khonsari, if that happens, Iranian President Rouhani has said, he's warned that the West will come to regret the day the nuclear agreement collapses, blaming the US for sabotaging the deal, as he says. What do you think he means by that?
Well, it's, you know, I think, I don't know exactly what he means, but I think it will be a very regretful event from any standpoint. The point is that Iran is entitled to having a legitimate defense force. Forget about carrying nuclear warheads, short of carrying nuclear warheads. What is Iran supposed to do to defend itself against, let's say, a country like Saudi Arabia or even the UAE with a superior air force that can destroy the Iranian air force in half a day? They have absolutely no weapons to defend themselves. Now, the Saudis have similar missiles on the other side. We don't hear anything being said about it. Now, the part that our American friend said about the Iranian rhetoric, I believe he's correct in that. I think that the Iranian regime has over the years inherited a set of slogans which it cannot use and it cannot dispose, which it must reject, because it's counter to Iranian national interest to pursue these kind of ridiculous statements. And the relationship, this relationship that it has created with Israel is certainly wrong for have created Iran's most natural ally in the Middle East to turn it into working with its most natural enemies against Iranian interests. Well, that also needs to be looked at. But the Americans cannot punish Iran for the government that they have, while at the same time they punish the people of Yemen for the government that they don't have, which is sitting in Riyadh, and prolonging the misery of the Syrian people because they're not happy about the outcome of the Syrian civil war. Now, these are the issues that are at stake, and certainly further negotiation is required to create a different atmosphere, but that does not need to happen by negating what they have signed. If President Trump doesn't like what President Obama signed, that's not the fault of the Iranian government or the other signatories. So they cannot turn a domestic political issue and rivalry into breaking internationally recognized agreements, which has been ratified by the Security Council as well.
Right. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, I would love to go on, but unfortunately, I've got to move on. One of the things I wanted to ask about, I don't have time to ask about, is, how on earth does Trump get the North Koreans to the table and get them to agree on anything if he tears up this deal?
Absolutely.
But that for another time. For the moment, I thank you all. James Phillips, Masuma Turfe, and Mehrdad Khonsari, thank you for joining us on the Newsmakers. 3 American senators are trying to pull the U.S. military out of Yemen. They say both Presidents Obama and Trump were never given the authorization to enter the conflict in the first place. Republican Mike Lee, Independent Bernie Sanders, and Democrat Chris Murphy are invoking the War Powers Act. In a nutshell, it forces the president to get congressional approval for any military operation lasting more than a month. So why hasn't that happened after 2 years and 10,000 dead civilians? Shoaib Hassan reports.
The UN says it's the world's biggest humanitarian disaster. Still, the war in Yemen is a conflict many Americans may not be too familiar with. A surprising detail, given that US military support and equipment have enabled a Saudi-led coalition to pummel the country. But that support could soon come to an end, or at least be severely curtailed if a bill is approved in the US Congress. Leading the charge is Senator Bernie Sanders.
We believe that as Congress has not declared war or authorized military force in this conflict, the United States' involvement in Yemen is unconstitutional and unauthorized, and U.S. military support of the Saudi coalition must end.
Since 2015, a Saudi-led Sunni coalition has been supporting President Abdul Rabb Mansour Hadi's forces. They're fighting Shia Houthi rebels allied with Iran for control of the country. The UN says the conflict has killed more than 10,000 people and injured at least 50,000. 10 million Yemenis are facing acute food shortages, and fighting has displaced 3 million others. Yemen is also facing the world's largest cholera outbreak, with 2,000 fatalities and 1 million people infected.
More people are going hungry, and famine remains a real threat. Although cholera cases are in decline, the disease is not yet beaten and is likely to rebound in the coming rainy season.
The UN has blamed the humanitarian crisis on the Saudi coalition and the man leading the alliance, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. He spearheaded the campaign that has blockaded Yemeni ports. The Saudis say they want to prevent Iranian arms from reaching the Houthis, but they've also blocked humanitarian aid.
And as you know, we've been calling for a full unwinding of the blockade, which has been preventing humanitarian assistance and commercial food and fuel get into Yemen. It needs to be fully wound down if we're to avoid an atrocious humanitarian tragedy involving the loss of millions of lives, the like of which the world has not seen for many decades.
The blockade's happening with explicit backing from the US and the United Kingdom.
Well, Labour backbenchers from sedentary positions are shouting shame. Can I just say to those backbenchers that the link that we have with Saudi Arabia is historic, it is an important one.
It's in the billions. US President Donald Trump also continues to support a campaign that rights groups say is killing 60 civilians a day. The US has traditionally been the Saudis' closest Western ally, and relations appear to have strengthened after Trump's visit to Riyadh last year. So, will Bernie Sanders be able to end the support for the Saudis? Or will America's historic ties with the House of Saud triumph in Yemen? Shoaib Hassan, The Newsmakers.
Let's go to our panel. Starting in Washington, D.C. is former U.S. Ambassador to Yemen, Gerald Firestein. Also in Washington is Phyllis Bennis, who directs the New Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. And finally, in the Swedish city of Gothenburg is the editor-in-chief of the Sana'a Review, Afrah Nasr. I thank you all for joining us. Phyllis Bennis, let me start with you. So, led by Bernie Sanders, the Sanders-Lee Yemen War Powers Resolution, the vote that will be had in the Senate, is it a good idea to discuss this?
It's very important. It's in many ways too late, but it's very important that finally the Congress, in this case the Senate, take responsibility for what is supposed to be, under our Constitution, the responsibility of the Congress, which is to declare war, to make the decisions about when to go to war. The president is responsible for executing those decisions, but it's supposed to be up to the Congress. There has been no authorization for this military engagement in Yemen. The officials in Washington who have said this is not our war are simply denying the fact that it could not be waged by the Saudis and the Emiratis without U.S. backing, which includes both massive arms sales, particularly of helicopter gunships, of planes, of bombers, but also very directly. U.S. pilots are flying U.S. Air Force planes to do the in-air refueling of those bombing raids to make it possible. There's been no authorization for that, and it's time there was a vote.
So, Ambassador Firestein, here's the thinking. The U.S. arms the Saudi-led coalition. They use those arms in what could be tantamount to war crimes, according to human rights activists, human rights groups, and that's why this needs to be pushed to the Senate so Congress can actually decide whether the U.S. should be involved in this war at all. Does that sound accurate to you?
Well, I think this is certainly the debate that goes on here in the United States as well as in the UK and elsewhere. And the issue is, how do you understand what it is that the Saudis are trying to accomplish? And is that legitimate? And beyond that, are they using appropriate means to try to achieve their objective? And so this is really the question that's before the Congress as well as more broadly in the society.
And so you followed it closely. So where do you stand on this? Is the Saudi-led coalition committing war crimes?
No, I don't believe that they're committing war crimes. I think that these are things that need to be explored and investigated. I don't believe that there is any kind of investigation yet that has established that this has happened. I think that there are two issues here. One is that the Saudi intervention, which the United States supported and still supports, was based on international law. There's a UN Security Council resolution, and also, of course, a recognition that the Saudis had legitimate security concerns. We can all agree that the implementation of the Saudi campaign, what's happened in the air campaign,
has had unfortunate collateral damage, unfortunate civilian casualties. And I think that to the extent that we can help the Saudis improve their performance, we should and need to do that. But I think that allegations about war crimes and other kinds of very hot language don't help the situation.
Okay, they don't help the situation, but that doesn't mean it might not be true. Phyllis, I'm going to give you a moment to respond in just a minute. I want to bring Afrah in now. Afrah, big picture, how much of a factor is the United States in the war practically as things stand?
The most powerful country in the world is supporting the Saudi-led coalition. There is no question about that. Since Barack Obama's administration till Donald Trump administration, there has always been the support policy to the Saudi-led coalition, and it's very frustrating to listen to anyone that thinks there are no war crimes committed in Yemen and they're just simply collateral damage. I don't know what to say to people who have lost loved ones at weddings, at funerals, at schools. These people have, legitimate right for justice, and definitely what's happening in Yemen is a war crime. Recently, there is concrete evidence submitted in a report by the Yemen panel, Yemen experts panel to the UN Security Council, in which they were listing in details all the humanitarian, international humanitarian laws that are violated over the past 3 years. And in 2 weeks, we're going to enter the 4th year of this really bloody war. So there is no any doubt that these countries in Western countries that are, having disregard to all these reports and still supporting a bloody war. What is happening is definitely, in so many levels, is war crime. The fact that myself, as I speak to you, I don't know who is going to be the next victim in Sana'a or Aden from my family. That by itself for me is a war crime. There is no any, no war is clean, and there is no war that never has innocent lives being wasted. And but the question would be, would the Congress really support the Congress latest movement will help in ending the war?
Right.
In my opinion, I think the final say would be, unfortunately, not at the international stage. It will be at the regional stage.
Right.
It's what the Saudis and the Emiratis would want. Unfortunately, just last week, there was another arms deals between NBS and UK with multi-billion.
And I'm gonna ask the ambassador about that in a moment. So just bear with me, because you're bringing up a bunch of issues here, sort of looking forward. But let me bring in Phyllis now. Phyllis, you were shaking your head when Ambassador Feinstein was saying that he doesn't think war crimes are being committed. Tell me why.
Well, we just heard some very powerful information from Afrah about the level of civilian casualties, 2/3 of the civilians, and we should recognize that there were 10,000 who had been killed as of January of last year, January of 2017, when the counting essentially stopped. There is significantly more. Maybe 11,000, maybe 12, maybe 13,000. We don't know how many. 2/3 of them have been killed by these U.S.-backed air raids, bombing raids, in which U.S. officials are already and have been engaging with the Saudis to, quote, help them in targeting. What they are doing is enabling this attack to go forward. And I would also challenge the ambassador on the question of U.S. law, beyond the international law question. The War Powers Act does not specify that it only kicks in when a certain level of war crimes have been committed. It is to apply to any use of force, any deployment of U.S. troops, including, in this case, Air Force pilots and others who are working in the rooms with the Saudi and Emirati forces who are choosing the targets, that sort of thing, that any deployment of force is to be determined by the Congress with only 3 exceptions, none of which apply here. If the U.S. territory is attacked, if U.S. personnel have been attacked, and these kinds of things have, or if U.S. territories have been attacked, the Houthis have not attacked the United States. So the notion that there is an exemption here, which of course, even when it's used, is only viable for 90 days, for 60 days, even under those circumstances, there has been no indication, and no one is even making the claim, that this has anything to do with an attack on the United States. This is about supporting Saudi Arabia in their regional challenge to Iran. This is all about the U.S. antagonism to Iran, and it's Yemenis paying the price.
Okay, so Ambassador Firestein, you've got your work cut out for you. You're in the minority on this panel. Both the other panelists disagree with you. Go ahead, sir.
Well, first of all, the last speaker made a number of assertions that I believe are not correct. The United States, certainly not when I was still in the government, and I haven't heard that it's changed since. The United States does not participate in identifying targets inside of Yemen, nor are U.S. pilots or other personnel involved directly in the conflict. The extent of U.S. engagement. Excuse me, I didn't interrupt you. There is no U.S. direct engagement except for some personnel who are involved in counterterrorism initiatives, which are covered under the AUMF, the use of military force. So I don't think that some of these assertions are correct. The United States does support Saudi Arabia and does support the coalition, and again, the coalition's activities are within the umbrella of UN Security Council Resolution 2216. The Saudi effort is engaged in trying to reestablish a legitimate government of Yemen in Sana'a, as supported by the international community. So again, we can talk about concerns that we all have, and I share those concerns about some of the aspects of the way this war has been pursued. We can try to improve the pursuit, but as your previous commentator noted, there is no conflict without unfortunate incidents. Certainly not in our experience in Afghanistan or elsewhere. And this is unfortunately the case here.
Let me ask you, Ambassador Firestein, since you do support the Saudi-led coalition's goals and aims, I know you're not a fan of the Houthis, I know you support Hadi's government and the US backing them. So if the vote goes through in the Senate and Congress says we shouldn't actually be in this war, would you want the president as commander-in-chief to ignore that vote?
Well, it depends on what the language of this resolution is. And, the United States, again, the role of the U.S. in this conflict is not such that were the U.S. to withdraw, that it would mean an end to the conflict. The Saudis and the Emiratis and the other coalition members would be perfectly capable of continuing the conflict without any engagement from the United States. So in that sense, it would be a meaningless resolution. But I do believe that if it comes to the president's desk, he should and would veto it.
Okay, so Afrah, I'm going to give you an opportunity to build on what you mentioned earlier on. And it basically follows through what Ambassador Firestein was saying. If the Americans actually withdraw, this would still continue because it will be sorted out, however ugly it gets, at a regional level, whether the United States is involved or not. Tell me a bit more about that, Afrah.
Well, I need to stress on the fact that all warring parties in Yemen have committed war crimes, not only the Saudi-led coalition, and all of them are responsible of the tragedy unfolding in Yemen. But definitely, the military abilities of the Saudi-led coalition is bigger and larger than the other warring parties. The fact that the Congress is trying to to put a political stance to what's going on in the conflict in Yemen. I think it's a symbolic move, and it's really hopeless at the White House. And Yemeni's hope is only in the Congress. That's what I've always believed in. But I'm not that optimistic, even though it's a great move and it's symbolic. But I'm not that optimistic because I think the Saudi and the Emirati lobby at the Capitol Hill is stronger. That we cannot underestimate how powerful such lobbying would be there. But no matter what is the result, in my opinion, I think the final say should be at the regional stage. Both the Saudis and the Emiratis have to understand that this is not the way to weaken the Houthis or the Iranis. This is not the way. There has to be another, political understanding from them in which, to save Yemenis' lives and to at least not let Yemen get this fragmented. The report that I was just mentioning earlier, it states clearly that Yemen as a state doesn't exist anymore. So is that what the Saudi-led coalition wanted to accomplish? Whether their goal is to reinforce the legitimacy of Abdurrabbu Mansour Hadi or not, I mean, regardless of this, what they are doing now is actually dissolving Yemen into pieces. There is no Yemen state anymore. So for how long they're going to continue with this, bloody war with such, pointless end? That's the question.
Right. Okay, we're out of time. I'll let that be the final word from the Yemeni on the panel. My apologies if we couldn't get more conversation in. The fault is all mine. But for the moment, Ambassador Gerald Firestein, Phyllis Bennis, and Afrah Nasr, I thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers.
We are very disappointed with the fact that a powerful politician would still oppress women and sexually harass them using his power. So we are very concerned and feel the need to change the mindset of South Korean society as quickly as possible.
Sexual harassment has long been a taboo subject in South Korea, but the Me Too movement may be changing that. A South Korean governor resigned after his secretary accused him of raping her. The government closed Nobel Prize-winning poet Ko Eun's exhibition after he was accused of sexual harassment. And the actor Jo Min-ki killed himself after allegations went public that he sexually assaulted at least 8 women. Well, to discuss this, I'm joined by Nancy Snow, a professor of public diplomacy at Kyoto University of Foreign Studies. And also joining us is the feminist writer who goes by the name Emily Singh. She runs the blog Real Koreans. I thank you both for joining us. Emily, let me begin with you. Has that resignation of the politician in South Korea opened things up in the country when it comes to sexual harassment and sexual assault?
Definitely. I think it is a good step towards making the right changes we need in Korean society, in politics, but also in wider society.
Mm-hmm. And tell me why it's been so much of a taboo subject up until now.
Well, I think there are several reasons. First of all, South Korea is a very hierarchical, very patriarchal society. So discussing issues such as sexual harassment were taboo in themselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Nancy, do you see similarities with Japan?
Oh, absolutely. What she just said there about certain taboo subjects. We also in Japan, it's a very hierarchical, and it is still quite a masculine society. Mm-hmm. And we know that Japan and the worldwide gender equality index is much lower than it should be. But I think there are some differences here as well, which have to do with South Korea really being a little bit more progressive in this arena. And it could have something to do with more of a sense of right and wrong that's a result of some of the Christianity that has a greater influence to play in South Korean society than it does in Japan.
Yeah, Emily, how would you compare what has emerged and unfolded now in South Korea versus what emerged and unfolded in the US with the Me Too movement there?
I think in some context it is very similar. It is a mass movement of women coming forward with their experiences and fighting for social justice. But the social context of what's happening in Korea is a little bit different because it seems to be more of a demand for anonymity. That's why, for example, I'm anonymous myself, and I don't really plan on releasing my real name, for example. Yeah, there is more of a need for security for the women who come forward in the Me Too movement in South Korea.
Yeah, and naturally, every time there's a movement, there's some pushback. Emily, so after Jong Min-ki hanged himself, we found another actor post something, I think his name was You Are In, showing images of people being burnt at the stake, and other people sort of bought into this meme that there's a witch hunt taking place against men. Do they have any credibility? Do they at least have some truth to what they're saying?
There is some validity in what they are feeling in as their individual persons, and they see those feminist movements as personal attacks on themselves. However, they need to realize that this is a systematic problem, that it's an institutional problem against women.
Yeah, and Emily, when Seoul closed an exhibition by the 84-year-old poet Ko Un, was that the right thing to do? Saying, okay, there's allegations of harassment, we're not going to give you any publicity, any attention, we're not going to treat you as normal until we sort this out.
I think it's a very clear message that things are moving in the right direction.
Yeah, and Nancy, talking about moving in the right direction, do you see what's happening in South Korea affecting what's happening in Japan? Because as you mentioned earlier, you feel that Japan is not quite there yet.
It isn't quite there yet. There has been some discussion about why the #MeToo movement hasn't really taken flight here. There have been some isolated cases, but it's still very difficult for women to come forward. We had International Women's Day recently, and there were some protesters out or people with placards, and they were using some humorous signs to bring attention to the ongoing problem here in Japan between men and women and the lack of equality. But I think that in Japan, that Me Too is viewed as too much of an import from the United States. And I believe that if there is going to be something happening here, it will be slower moving than what is happening in South Korea. And it will have to come from within Japanese society and maybe from the grassroots and then putting pressure on the government. I don't see it as going from the government down to the grassroots. So far, it's the talk in the Abe administration has been about womenomics, and a lot of that has had to do with productivity. Emily makes a great point, though, that this is a systemic problem. And if there were a way to frame this as being good for everyone, this awakening, that it would help economic productivity, that would make people feel less like they're being targeted or that it's some type of man-hating mechanism.
Yeah. Emily, it's fascinating because Ms. Kim Ji-eun said that she got the courage to come forward after what happened in the US mainly. And what we're hearing from Nancy is that that's less likely to happen in a place like Japan because it's seen as an import. It's seen as somebody else's battle in another country. Is that the key difference between the two countries, maybe?
I think there is that difference in perception. It is true that the Me Too movement, as we see it in the press right now, is something that started in the US. However, there is a build-up to this movement that's happening in Korea that already began in 2015 with feminist websites becoming very popular, and in 2016 with the Gangnam murder case. So that's a continuation in the Korean context.
Nancy, for those who say, where are the laws on the books that are actually advocating for sexual harassment or sexual assault? There aren't any laws on the books that are discriminating against women. When you say culture or you say patriarchy, it's very nebulous and it's very subjective. Do they have a point?
Right. It is somewhat subjective, but I think here in Japan, people have to really believe that stepping forward is not going to come at such a great personal cost. Also, you don't have people working through the legal system so much. Everything here is about culture and about the seasons, and things take time, and you don't want to upset the natural flow and the social harmony of society. Somebody sticking out too much and seen as quote unquote complaining, that's an outlier, and that person is not often appreciated. It would take a number of people collectively, men and women here in Japan, who are inspired by what's happening increasingly globally and who feel like they want to be part of this global community to make a change. With the approaching Tokyo 2020 Olympics and with the eyes of the world more on Japan, there are many more foreign tourists here than ever. There will be a sense of pressure, outside pressure, and that might change things and speed things up here.
Yes, some intriguing insights and analysis as to how Me Too affects the context in East Asia. It's been fascinating learning about it from both of you, Nancy and Emily. I've got to move on, but I thank you very much for joining us here on The Newsmakers. Well, that's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, Baghdad guts funding for the Kurdish regional government. Is it punishment for their push for independence? And could it backfire? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.